Judy Sheppard.
Thank you for that. I don't know how much more of this you can take this afternoon. I sort of feel a bit cruel coming in and going to show you more shocking evidence of what's going on. However, I will. Came a long way for this. And I guess the reason I can show this with confidence is because I took every one of these pictures but one. Because I'm on this community consultative committee for the Dendrobium mine, which is mining in the special areas south of Sydney, I get out there a lot with the company and also independently with the Sydney Catchment Authority. And I see this evidence with my own eyes. And I guess it's because I keep seeing it and because they don't learn. The government doesn't learn. The evidence is there, as I'm going to show you, but the government takes no notice. It just makes me angrier and angrier and angrier. And I would love to stop doing this. I'm so over it. But I guess every time an election comes around particularly, you think, well, we've got an opportunity to maybe make a difference. So once again, we're gearing up with all these presentations that I'm doing to try and make the politicians and the public of Sydney particularly aware of what's going on in their own drinking water catchment. I'm not going to talk about CSG. CSG is not my thing. I've become a specialist in longwall mining. Now, we're very lucky in Sydney that we don't have open cut mining like they have up in the Hunter. And whenever I go up there, and I've been up there a lot and seen what goes on, I come back and I think, well, God, I'm not dealing with that. You know, what we've got's bad enough. But anyway, I'm going to now talk to you about the impacts. And firstly, I just want to talk to you about the area. Most people think that, you know, Sydney gets its water from Warragamba Dam. And the Warragamba, I knew I was going to do that. Get this thing right. The Warragamba catchment over here to the west is massive, and the dam is massive, but it's in a very variable area for rainfall. It's not reliable at all. And predating Warragamba Dam, we had the dams of the Upper Nepean system built here in the early part of the 20th century, and also Warramurra Dam here. And these are on the coast, on the escarpment directly behind Wollongong, on what's called the Warramurra Plateau, in an area of very high and very reliable rainfall. And even the Chief Scientist report that has just come out talked about how, with climate change, these dams are going to be more and more crucial to Sydney's water supply because of that very point. They're in the area of high and reliable rainfall. Unfortunately, that's also where the coal is mined, and that's where the coal seams are. And by the way, this coal is not the same as the coal that they mine up in the Hunter, which is thermal coal for power stations. This coal is what they call metallurgical coal. It's coal that's used in blast furnaces for steel making. It's incredibly valuable. It's very high quality on the world scale. Other countries are very keen to get it. And most of our steel making is gone overseas anyway. So most of this stuff gets exported now. We don't have any more steel making in Newcastle, nor in Wollongong. I think there's a bit in Whyalla, and that's about it. So, unfortunately, the coal is still there. It's very valuable for the multinational companies that are ripping it out, and it's also very valuable for the government in terms of the royalties that they get. We've got this problem of the almighty dollar, which rules everything. But we've also got the problem of this being a special area. Now these red lines denote the special areas. They're the inner sanctums of the Sydney Catchment Authority's domain, where they're looking after our water supply. They're the areas that are virtually gated and padlocked and you can't walk in. You see the signs all around the edges, and you're supposed to keep out. In fact, it is up to $44,000. That's actually a fine for a corporate breach. If you and I walk in there, it could be up to $22,000, half of that. But still, we don't go in there and we don't get to see it. I feel very privileged to be able to get in there and see it, but I wish I wasn't getting in there and seeing it being trashed all the time. But anyway, so that's where the companies are doing their mining, and what we've got there, and where you saw the damage already, and even on the flyer for today, you saw that classic photo of the accidents. I took that photo back in November 2006. That's on Waratah Rivulet. Now, Waratah Rivulet is a basket case, and it's a classic case. Waratah Rivulet's up here. It feeds the Warranora Dam, which is a standalone dam for the Sutherland Shire, and had no other alternative water supply, so it's very important. I wish they would be more concerned about it, but anyway. That damage occurred, and we made it public when it was discovered in the end of 2006. Since then, as I'm going to show you in my photos, nothing's changed. Unfortunately, Waratah River is continuing to be trashed. And those lessons that should have been learnt from that damage on Waratah River are being repeated. You'll have to bear with me. They're being repeated as the mining continues down here. Now, the Dendrobium mine that I'm on the community consulting committee for is a BHP mine there, mining in between the Lake Cordeaux and Lake Avon. We've also got now, this one's up here, it used to be called NRE number 1, it's now called Wollongong Coal. This is by a wholly owned Indian company, owns that. They rip the coal out, they send it overseas unwashed. That's just a raw coal with all the dirt and all the rock and everything in it that we normally separate, and that's called coal wash, and that's called coal. They take it overseas unwashed. That's how valuable they think it is. And they also brought up some old BHP leases down here, and we're running another mine which has just last week gone into mothballs because of the unprofitable nature of it. So at the moment we've really only got 3 companies or 3 mines active. A couple of others here in mothballs. Cordeaux is also in mothballs, that's an old BHP mine. Up here, by the way, we were going to have a massive mine up here which is just outside of the catchment area, but that's where we've now got the Darawal National Park. I don't know if you know that story, but that's another story I can tell you another time. That was a win against the coal mines. We don't have too many of them. Anyway, so that's where it's all happening. I'm going to be talking about this area here. That's where the damage is happening. That's where the intensity of the mining is. So let's go on. I don't know if I need to go on about this, but when I say longwall mining, I wonder how many people really know what I'm talking about. Who knows what I'm talking about when I say longwall mining? Okay, well that's what they do. Longwall mining is a very highly sophisticated method of ripping coal out as fast as you can. They do it 365 days a year. This longwall machine never stops except when they get to the end of a panel and they turn around and have to take that machine out and put it in and start another panel. There's about a 3-week downtime. It takes them about a year to do a whole panel of coal. They rip it out like this. There's a massive shearer here, which is like a huge big Devon slicer. It just goes along the face of the panel. The panels are now up to 400 metres wide, and they can be several kilometres long, and all the coal drops onto a conveyor belt here, which is taken out and taken away to the surface. The whole of the roof is held up with hydraulic. There's a whole hydraulic chocks here with a cantilevered roof, and amazingly, this system was developed. It only came to Australia in the 1970s. They move this thing forward, and as it moves forward, the excavated panel, the space left by the coal being removed, just all the strata above just collapse into it. So you get this massive distortion of all the rock strata above, and that's how you get what's called subsidence on the surface. Now, depending how deep the coal seam is, that subsidence will be more or less pronounced. The science behind what really is happening over here is still not known. There are conferences and papers being written about this all the time. I mean, I've been involved in this now since 2001, and there's so much more that's coming out of every conference that's held. And the industry itself, all the people, all the consultants are doing massive amounts of research to see what really does happen here. How much connection is there from the surface to the mine? You know, what's happening in the Sydney sandstone above there. But what we do know is happening, it's manifested from the pictures that I'm going to show you. When you get subsidence on the surface, especially in Sydney sandstone country, where all the creeks, rivers have beds of sandstone, the swamps are sitting on sandstone bedrock. Of course, sandstone is very brittle, it cracks. Blind Freddy doesn't have to tell you that. It's going to happen. They predict this. They always predict all this. They predict the damage, and that's why it's so scandalous that these mines continue to be approved. But, you know, in a nutshell, that's what's happening. Now, the range of impacts there, from that subsidence, from that dipping, the whole of the landform drops, and typically in the southern coalfield, that drop can be up to 2 metres. I'll just go back because you have the greatest impacts there at the edges, where you've got strains. You can imagine if things are pulled over an edge, the rock strains, that's where the greatest impacts are shown, and I'll show you how that manifests on the surface. And of course, I mean, all through that bowl, you get impacts, particularly on those edges. So you get stream bed cracking, you get loss of the surface flows because the water goes down through the cracks. You get contamination of that water because it goes down, you go down, you know, 15 metres, and it re-emerges. If there's a steep incline on the stream, it might re-emerge further downstream, but it brings up a hell of a lot of contaminants because the water's going past all these broken up rock faces. It's like just rubble underground. All the broken up new faces of rock, which have a lot of iron in them, particularly in the Sydney sandstone. All those minerals are leached out in the water, which might re-emerge downstream, heavily contaminated. Then you get gas venting as well. You get swamp draining. You get surface fissures where the ground just opens up, and you get cliff falls. And all that's happening in our drinking water catchments. Then you have the surface disturbance for the infrastructure going in there, all the work they do to explore, to monitor. Monitoring going on like you wouldn't believe. They monitor as it just is destroyed. You know, there's so many papers being written on it, just watching the destruction, but they don't do anything about it. And remediation, which is an absolute farce. So there's that classic picture, Waratah Rivers. November 2006, some of us went down with Sydney Catchment Authority when we got word that this was happening after a couple of intrepid conservationists did a recce without permission and saw exactly the state of Waratah Rivulet. Then we got permission and went into the Sydney Catchment Authority and were shown the damage. It was just unbelievable. This is in drought too, by the way. Now, but normally this stream still would be flowing because all the streams in these areas are fed by upland swamps. And those upland swamps are sitting there, there's a massive mosaic of them right across the Warranora Plateau. They hold the water right through drought times. They release the water gradually, like a great big sponge. They're like, one of the wonderful descriptions is nature's leaky storage. They're like dams, but they're dams feeding the rivers, and that's what creates the base flow in a river. That's why our rivers continue to flow when there's no rain for months and months and months. But that river would have been still flowing in that drought period, except for the fact that it had been totally busted up by mining. So this is the sort of damage we saw. This was a beautiful waterfall. That whole section just dropped out of it. All that section where there's red colour would have had water flowing over it. This was just heartbreaking. This was what was obviously once a great big long, probably it was a sandy bottom, but underneath the sand would be that bedrock that's cracked. It just drained like a bathtub. It's completely dry. And where there was water, this was closer up near the swamp, there was still some water in some pools, highly contaminated. And what you get when you get the iron, lots of iron in the water, there's a bacterium that actually feeds on the iron and forms these rafts and mats it all up and sticks to everything. And so you've got a lot of that stuff happening too. So that was 2006. This was 2011 when I went back there. So 5 years later. Still pretty disgusting. Gas venting. And this was after they had continued mining and been given approval to continue mining despite all that damage that had been shown beforehand. That's the colour of the water in 2011 where it did re-emerge downstream. This is in Sydney's drinking water catchment. This is flowing in the Warranora Dam. And that was actually in 2012 when I was there too. Still pretty disgusting. That was 2012. That's the only photo I didn't take. That was in February of this year. That's the latest damage. That's a massive big long pool called Pool N, bone dry. Again. So this is, despite the damage that was shown back in 2006, been written up in all sorts of mining journals and papers and conference notes and everything. they're still doing it. So they don't learn, and the government keeps approving this sort of thing. That's why I'm so angry, and that's why I think you should be angry and everyone should be scandalised. By the way, this is the mine plan for this colliery. It's called the Metropolitan Colliery. It operates out of Helensburgh. It's run by the biggest mining company in the world, the multinational Peabody. And the damage that we found in 2006 had occurred right down here in the upper reaches. Then they had a commission inquiry. This is their big expansion. They had a commission inquiry, planning assessment commission hearings, where they allowed them to do 2 more longwalls directly under the river, despite what they knew what was going to happen. Then they've sterilised a bit of coal here. That's a sterile zone. They're not allowed to go in there, just to protect. And I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's just like a token gesture. And then this has all been approved. This goes right under the stored water of Lake Woronora. So go figure. I mean, if they're worried about what's happening up here, and yet they allow them to do 2 more longwalls, and then they sterilise that to protect that bit of the river lake rather, and then they're going to allow them to go under the stored water, I don't get it. Anyway, these swamps. This is Dendrobium. That's a healthy swamp. That is a magnificent swamp. All these swamps have got numbers. We actually use some numbers. That one's called swamp 1A. Anyway, it's a magnificent swamp, and that's a typical swamp with the typical indicator plant, the Banksia robur. Beautiful, healthy Banksia robur there, and all these sedges and everything. And when you walk through a healthy swamp, it's squelch as you'd expect. Another beautiful, healthy swamp. This is above another one called Swamp 15B. And this is just on the edge of the swamp, and a bit more Banksia robur and a lot of other things, coral ferns, just magnificent. The heartbreaking thing was we went out and saw these swamps pre-mining, and we knew they were going to be mined. I almost thought, can I bear to go back and see them after the mining? That I have been, and this one's stuffed. That's a typical outlet stream from a swamp. So the swamp, all the swamp water drains out and comes down a little stream, crystal clear. You know, beautiful pools. You can drink that water. Perfect. That's one of the pools further down. When they mine under the swamp, though, and this is what happened to 15B, this is all the monitoring that they do. They have pixometers, which they sink down into the swamp sediments, down to bedrock, and they can measure the groundwater level. So pre-mining, this is where the first longwall went through that green thing, Longwall 7. This was in 2011. Yeah, that's typical. You've got your rainfall, and you've got the groundwater held in the swamp. No problem. It's just there. It only varies a bit, but it's always got water in it. The longwall goes through, bang. The groundwater just plummets, and then flatlines. Because the bedrock's cracked, it's just draining the water out down into the strata below. It's not holding the water. So it's no longer a swamp. That happens to every swamp that they undermine, and they're doing that systematically. This poor old swamp had, it was already stuffed up. The first longwall went through, the second longwall, longwall 8, went through a year later, and it was still flatlining. Look, there's a spike of rain there. But it's just like, as I said, a bathtub, plug pulled out, or holes all drilled in the bottom of it. It just can't hold the water. So the swamp's not able to do its function as a swamp. This is when they undermined the very first swamp, Swamp 1. This swamp was quite a small one, and it has very shallow sediments. It's up on the side of a hill, and it had some exposed bedrock. And this was after they mined it, so this is typical of what is continuing right across that swamp, because it's destroyed as well. But that's the sort of cracking that you get, and that's just off into the sediments. It's my foot there. Where those sediments, which previous to that, when we'd gone and seen that swamp pre-mining, would just squelch, squelch, squelch. They're just fine and powdery, totally desiccated, and nothing's changed there. That was mined in 2008, that one. And this is what's happening to the Banksia roba. They're dying, or they die. I think that one was dead already. And that's in Swamp 15B. That first one was in Swamp 1, and this one's in Swamp 15B. It takes quite a while, especially if you get rain like we're having now. The vegetation will hang on. The vegetation doesn't show overnight changes necessarily. But the Banksia roba there, they've got the big surface area of their leaf. They're going to show those impacts, and certainly those ones are dying, and the rest of that vegetation. It won't necessarily all die. What happens is, now this is a swamp, this was mined back in the early 2000s. Back in 2007 we had a thing called the Southern Coalfield Inquiry. The government thought, you beauty, the government's having this inquiry. This is after we've done a lot of campaigning to actually look at what's happening in our catchments. It was a massive inquiry, cost a lot of money, and we had panellists and we took them out into the field and showed them the damage, and this is a BHP swamp that had been undermined in the early 2000s. Totally collapsed. It's called Swamp 18. And this is a classic example of a collapsed swamp. Firstly, all of this black, dark looking stuff is peat. That's really over my head. I'm standing down in a big chasm here. That peat is dried out and it becomes really hard. After this, there was a wildfire that went through. Now, no swamp that is healthy, that therefore retains water, is destroyed by a wildfire. The vegetation on the top might burn, but the root mass, plants themselves aren't destroyed, and a swamp will return to health really quickly after a fire because of the water that's retained in the sediments. If the sediments are dried out, swamps are hugely vulnerable to wildfire, or any fire, because the fire goes through, it burns everything, it burns right down through all the root mass. In fact, some swamps smoulder for years because you've got that depth of peat. Then what happens if you get a heavy rainfall event, you get this massive erosion, and this swamp has just got big canyons eroded out of it where the peat has just been barreled out downstream because there's nothing to hold it together. Then what happens is all that swamp vegetation is gone, and what has come and replaced it, this happened in about 2003, so I'm there in 2007, that's about only 4 years later. But the wattles and the eucalypts, all the dry sclerophyll vegetation's come back and replaced all that swamp vegetation, so everything's changed. It's not a swamp anymore, it doesn't even look like a swamp anymore, it's not holding water, and all the vegetation's changed. So, complete reversal of what it's supposed to be. And despite all that knowledge of what happens, at the end of in 2012, Dendrobium applied to move into their next area, which is called Area 3B. And this is where the biggest concentration of swamps is. 4 massive swamps there, all feeding up that way. They're actually not feeding into Lake Avon, they're actually feeding into Pheasant's Nest Weir, which is where water for the Macarthur region where I live is drawn from. We could see that their first longwall, they were starting up here, was going to cut across these 4 swamps in one swathe. We knew what was going to happen to them. Despite a huge effort on the part of the committee that I'm on and other groups that I'm involved with to try and get this changed, this was approved. They only gave them approval. They gave them approval for the first 5 longwalls, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they've got to apply again to get approval here. As we said to them, and the reason the company blackmailed the government. They virtually said, well, you've got to give us approval of this because we've already put the first workings in. Those orange lines are the underground roadways. And companies typically, they do this to hold the government to ransom because they put all that infrastructure in before they even get approval. Underground, they put all that underground infrastructure in, and then they say, oh, we've already done that, so, and if you make us do something different, or we have to shut the mine down, all these people will be out of work. And the government just caves into that sort of argument every time. Anyway, they were given approval. They'd only done 2 longwalls of underground workings. And we said to them, well, you know, we didn't even, of course we weren't happy with that, but they didn't need to give them approval for the next 3. And when we found that they'd given them approval for 5, I actually rang planning and spoke to a guy called David Kitto that some of you might have heard of. I said, David, why did you feel the need to give them the approval for the other 3? He said, oh, well, we knew that over the swamps would already be stuffed, so what would the difference be? Those were his words to me, and I wish I had a recording device on the phone.
Had it been Gloucester.
Yeah, David Kiddo is well known. Anyway, so they've already done that one. They're in here now, and they're about halfway along here. These 4 swamps are already showing serious signs of being impacted on, and you know, it's just more of the same. And every reason given for that approval by Senator Haddad was economic. Economic. And of course then, since then, we've had Hardship put the economy up there in legislation, and the mining set amendment didn't put up where the economic consideration is the head of consideration. So, you know, I don't know what chance we've got now. Those are the sorts of things we've got to get changed. But it's so hard because, you know, that one particularly is now enshrined in the legislation.
If I make a suggestion, vote them out. Let them know.
Yeah, unfortunately,
really powerless.
Unfortunately, whatever flavour you get in, I think it's the same. Yeah, so now I'm talking, these are ground fissures. This was our committee out on an inspection where we were told there would be gaps opened up in the ground. Well, on that day, this chap, he actually fell down. This is only one of many that we inspected. He actually fell down one of these up to his armpits. So they're quite an OH&S issue. But on that day, we were looking at these, and there was a whole parallel series of these across the landscape. Now, this is in our drinking water catchment. You can imagine the idea of a drinking water catchment is that the rain will fall on the ground and it will run down across the ground and then into the streams and into the rivers and into the dams. But if you have it like opened up like Swiss cheese, that water is now going down God knows where. It's certainly not going into the catchment, into the storage rather. So we looked at these, the company, we were out with BHP, hands up for the road vests. We were out there and they showed us this series of openings across an easement, under a power line easement, so it was clear. And as we had learnt, you cannot trust BHP. Would you be surprised to hear that? We don't trust them. So we typically, often, will arrange a separate inspection with the Sydney Catchment Authority to go and see the things that BHP didn't show us. And we went out there, it was only a couple of weeks later, and we found the grandmother or granddaddy of all fissures in the ground. This was massive, and this went for hundreds of metres across into the bush, and there was a whole series of these too. That was about a metre wide at the top, and you know, the company will say they go down at least 15 metres. I don't think they have any idea how far down they go. And then they hadn't shown us these, and when I complained at the next meeting, they said, oh, you never asked. Anyway, we got on the front page of the Illawarra Mercury with that. And this sort of thing, this is just a massive, massive outcrop of rock that's just split asunder with the strains, obviously, when you've had the subsidence. Yep. Okay, this is a cliff fall. Again, this was another inspection after we'd been shown cliff falls with BHP. We went out with the Sydney Catchment Authority and we found far greater cliff falls, far more cliff falls, and cliff falls that hadn't been reported to planning, and they got into trouble out of that. Massive cliff falls tumbling down into the valleys. This is surface infrastructure disturbance. When they go and do exploration for mining, they do seismic lines. You might have seen this all across Central Australia. They do seismic testing where they send a pulse down into the ground to get a reading back of what's under the ground in the geology. Well, to do that, they have these straight lines that they clear. Lots of those. That's an old one, so that one's been, you know, that's growing back. But then you've got heaps of these sorts of things. This is to put down a monitoring bore that is standing. Huge area cleared. And this sort of thing. The further they get away from the pit top for Dendrobium is at Mount Kembla. It's an access road for a vent shaft. massive area cleared to bring in all the equipment, bring in the power, trucks, months and months and months of work, and all this is in the catchment, you know, you're not supposed to do this sort of thing, and they just do this, the companies do this on a daily basis, building this sort of thing. They have an upcast and a downcast, and there's 3 there, maybe 2 upcasts and 1 downcast, I'm not sure. But this is typical of mines. You have to have this infrastructure if you're going to have an underground mine. Then they do remediation, and of course this is, they got awards for this, Peabody Energy did. This is at Waratah Rivulet, where after doing what they did that I showed you in 2006, they went back years later, it took them years to do this, and they did grouting. Now, the stuff they use is called polyurethane resin, and quite honestly, it just looks like stuff you buy, the expanding foam that you buy at Bunnings. But what they do is you can see here they've done it on a pool, they drill hundreds and hundreds of holes and they inject it. I mean, hundreds of thousands of litres of it. It costs them multi-million dollars to do this, and they've done it on 1 rock bar only. And of course, we don't know, no one knows about the longevity of this stuff, how long it will last. You know, you could have a minor earthquake or something that could open it all up again. The stuff just, the problem is the cosmetic nature of it is just disgusting. You know, you don't expect to see this sort of thing. It's just all oozing out everywhere, you know, just hideous. And as I say, it's highly experimental, and even to do it, they were in there for months and months and months, and they had a huge work area cleared. This was all pristine, untouched bushland, and all these areas are just sort of scarred and left like that. And if they do any more, and I think they are supposed to be doing more, you know, it'll be more of the same. So that's unfortunately the sad story that I have to tell you about what's happening in your drinking water catchments.